sovereign care over this planet. Our planet was designed by an all-knowing, loving creator, and we would expect that he would design everything so that our climate would have some degree of stability built into it. And of course, we're told after the flood, God promised that there would be a degree of climate stability. In Genesis 8:22, it says, "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease." Furthermore, we might expect that there are positive aspects of warming. Even if warming does occur, it's kind of naive to assume that it would all be bad. You're going to get more plants because plants need carbon dioxide. If you have warmer temperatures, that will enable you to grow crops at higher latitudes at places where now it's too cold, and you can produce more food. Furthermore, you expect to have fewer cold-related deaths. Now, some people do die prematurely from excessively high temperatures. You hear about these heat waves where people die of heat stroke or whatever, but a lot more people die prematurely from cold winter temperatures than they do from warmer temperatures. In fact, there's some evidence that this increased carbon dioxide may be causing the deserts to start to bloom around the edges. We're finding that there are plants and trees and things growing at the edges of the deserts, and the only thing that's changed is the amount of carbon dioxide. So it looks like this is enabling plants to grow in places they could not previously grow. And I want to also point out that when the environmentalists get worked up about this, they often take positions that are directly contrary to Scripture. For instance, God told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, and he told Noah and his family after the flood to do the same. It's for you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply in it. Now, what are the environmentalists saying, however? They're saying there's too many people. They say we need population control, and I think many of them are using that as a fig leaf to try to justify things like abortion. So first, we have a denial of God's sovereign care, and there is definitely a denial of Genesis history. You see, the Bible helps us make sense of past climate change. There was an ice age. There is strong geological evidence for that, but this idea of millions of years, that's not demanded by the evidence. Those conclusions are coming from a philosophy called uniformitarianism that the Apostle Peter warned us about. And uniformitarianism denies creation and the flood. Those things are not on the table for discussion. And so Peter, again, in his second epistle, he told us that there would come in the last days, he said, scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lust and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. That is a very good description of a uniformitarian philosophy that denies creation and the flood. As it turns out, though, the flood gives us an extremely good explanation for an ice age. There was a lot of, the Bible talks about the fountains of the great deep being broken up. That implies a lot of geological and tectonic activity. In fact, most creation scientists think plate tectonics played a major role in the Genesis flood. But it wasn't the slow, gradual continental drift that you've been taught about. It was more like a continental sprint. And you may not know this, but one of the world's leading experts in this field, if not the leading expert, is a biblical creationist who's done a lot of computer modeling in this area to see how plate tectonics would have played a role in the flood. But the flood, because of rapid seafloor spreading and volcanic activity, that gives us a very good explanation for an ice age. And it also helps to explain a lot of mysteries of Earth history, like the woolly mammoths. How is it that millions of woolly mammoths were able to live in Siberia during the ice age when winter temperatures are typically minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit today? And then why did they become extinct? And why is it that some parts of the world that today are extremely dry and arid once received much more rainfall, like the Middle East? We have ample evidence from Scripture in Genesis that the Middle East used to receive a lot of rainfall. Well, if you'd like to learn more about this, we have a book called Guide to Creation Basics, and one of the topics covered in there is the Ice Age. How does the Bible explain the Ice Age? We also have a series called Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis. It's a 12-part DVD series that's sort of a broad overview of this whole creation-evolution debate. And one of those is devoted explicitly to the Ice Age. Now, uniformitarians, of course, believe there was an Ice Age. In fact, they believe there were many Ice Ages. But because they reject the biblical account, they have to come up with some other explanation. And they've come up with dozens of theories. None of them are very good. In fact, this is considered one of the great mysteries of science. Now, they do have a theory that's very popular. It's called the Milankovitch theory, sometimes called the astronomical theory. And the basic idea is that you have the tilt of the Earth's axis. That axis is slowly tilting. The tilt is slowly changing, and it's actually wobbling. And the shape of the Earth's orbit is slowly changing. Now, of course, these changes take many thousands of years, but since uniformitarians believe the solar system is billions of years old, they feel free to run the calculations backwards thousands and millions of years. And as a result of those presumed changes, the way the sunlight is falling on the Earth is going to change. It's going to vary with season and latitude over time. And in a nutshell, their theory says that when you have less summer sunlight falling on the high latitude northern ice sheets, those ice sheets are able to grow and you get an ice age. But on the other hand, when there's more of that high latitude summer sunlight, the ice sheets retreat, if you will. They melt back and you get a warmer period that they call an interglacial. Now, one problem with this theory is that these changes in sunlight are very tiny, and it's hard to see how that by itself could cause an ice age. And creation scientist Larry Vardaman pointed out years ago, this is leading secular scientists to conclude that our climate is unstable. Okay, and if you look in the secular literature, you will see all these papers where they talk about climate instability, and it's not coming from meteorology. It's coming from the way they're interpreting, the information about the past. So you have a denial of God's sovereign care, you have a denial of Genesis history, and we see a lot of evidence that climate alarmism is bearing some very, very bad fruit. And that's exactly what the Lord told us. He said, He gave us a test whereby we can determine whether or not a movement or a teaching or a person is from God. Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. And we see that this environmental movement is bearing a lot of bad fruit. In fact, secular scientists not that long ago suggested that there's a lot of cropland in the former Soviet Union or some of those Soviet republics that had been unused for many years. And they were talking about, well, maybe we can start cultivating this land again. But in Nature, not that long ago, secular scientists said, no, well, maybe we should leave that cropland uncultivated, because if we start cultivating it, there's going to be a net increase in our carbon footprint, and that's bad for global warming. So you see now, not only are they saying you can't drive an SUV or you can't use an incandescent light bulb, now they're saying we're growing too much food. They're talking about limiting the amount of food that we can produce. And when you think about all the people in the world who are hungry today, it seems unconscionable that they would even contemplate something like that. Even worse, some of these secularists have talked about genetically engineering people to fight global warming. They've talked about doing things like giving us drugs to take away our taste for meat. That by itself is just horrible. I mean, that's too horrible to contemplate right there. But not only that, they want to make us so we won't need as much food. And they've even talked about giving us eyes like cats so we can see in the dark and we won't need as much electricity, thereby reducing our carbon footprint. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty scary to me. And that's an indication that this movement is bearing some very bad fruit. So there's an evolutionary connection. There's also something called the reinforcement syndrome. Now, what is that? This is sort of a psychological phenomenon in science where junior scientists will find evidence for an idea proposed by a respected senior scientist, even when the idea is wrong. Okay? So in other words, they're confirming something that isn't real because a respected scientist told them it was true, and they think they find evidence for it. And a lot of times the data are massaged, perhaps unconsciously, to get what they think is the right answer. And we actually see this with this astronomical theory. The reason that most secular scientists today believe that this astronomical theory is correct is because of a paper that was published 40 years ago in Science called The Pacemaker of the Ice Ages. And basically, according to these, you can do these astronomical calculations, and when you do, you find that you should have these orbital cycles of 100,000, 42,000, and 23,000 years. There's other cycle lengths as well. Those are some of the big ones. Well, secular scientists sometimes drill and extract cores from the ocean floor. You've got all this mud on the ocean floor. They extract these cores, and they can examine them, and they can make chemical measurements in the core. And if you plot those on a graph, those chemical measurements, you will see a whole lot of wiggles. And they think those wiggles are telling them a story about climate change in the prehistoric past. Now, one of the quantities they measure is something called the oxygen isotope ratio. Now, we're not going to get bogged down in all the chemistry, but here's the important thing. They think this quantity that's denoted by that little symbol right there is a climate indicator. And specifically, they think it tells you how much ice you've got on the planet. So, for example, if you have high values of that oxygen isotope number, that means globally there's more ice. Okay, so that would mean you're in an ice age. And by the way, think about this for a second. If the amount of water on the earth stays constant and you have more water locked up into ice, what is going to happen to the sea level? It has to drop. That's exactly right. Okay, so not only did they think this tells them how much ice was on the planet at some time in the prehistoric past, they also think it tells you what this global sea level was. And likewise, when you have lower values of this number, that's supposed to be a warmer period with less ice and higher sea levels. Now keep that in mind because that's going to become very important here in a little bit. So what these scientists did is they went and they got 2 cores from the southern Indian Ocean, and they did their little analysis on those wiggles, and they found evidence, so they thought, of climate cycles having lengths of 100,000, 42, and 23,000 years. Oh, that's the same as the astronomical cycles. So in their minds, this was very strong evidence for this astronomical ice age theory. Now, in order to do this, they had to assign tentative timescales to those 2 cores. And that's not trivial because as a general rule, you cannot use radioisotope dating on seafloor sediments. So they used a backdoor approach. The Earth's magnetic field has flipped many times in the past, where the north magnetic pole has flipped with the south magnetic pole. We would argue these reversals occurred during the Genesis flood. They were associated with the flood event, but secular scientists claim that they occurred hundreds of thousands and even millions of years ago. Well, when lava cools, it records information about the direction of the Earth's magnetic field. And so sometimes you will see evidence of a magnetic reversal, a flip, recorded in these volcanic rocks. Well, volcanic rocks can be dated, well, at least they think they can be dated with radioisotope dating methods. So what they did, they found some rocks that recorded the most recent flip of the Earth's magnetic field. And when they did that, and when they used potassium-argon dating on it, they got an age of 700 years. And that number played an important role in that paper. They used that number to set up their timescales before they did their analysis. Here's the catch, though. 25 years ago, this is around 1990, 1992 or so, the uniformitarians revised the age of that magnetic reversal to 780,000 years. So they no longer believe it was 700,000 years ago. But they never went back to check and see how that would affect the original results. So basically, I did their job for them. Okay? I went back. First thing I had to do is I had to reconstruct their data from the paper because you can't get the data online, and the 2 surviving authors would not respond to my request for their data. So I had to reconstruct the data, just literally reading the numbers off the graphs. That was like 603 data points that I had to very, very carefully read off those graphs. And then I used their method and verified that I could replicate their results, getting pretty much the same answers they did. And then I went back and I redid the calculations using this new number. And guess what that does? Well, it messes everything up. The net effect of this is that you stretch the time scales that they assigned to those cores. So that first core, the time scale got stretched by about 13%. The second core, the time scale got stretched by 11%. And they also had this composite core, if you want to call it that, where they took data from the first core, data from the second core, and just kind of stuck them together and called that a core. And that one got stretched 12%. And so what that does, the lengths of the climate cycles get stretched by that amount. So in one of the core, in the second core, the first core, it doesn't mess up the results too bad. But in the second core, these new climate cycle lengths are going to get multiplied by 1.11. It's going to be 111% of the original value. So these are the actual cycle lengths that they reported in the original paper. And of course, over here, these are the numbers that you were supposed to get. That's the right answer, quote unquote, over on the right-hand side. And you can already see here, this 47, this is dangerously high already. Okay, but what happens when you multiply these numbers by 1.11? Well, here are the new numbers. Now, the 121, there's enough uncertainty that you don't really have to worry about that too much. But these other two are too high. They're just too high. They no longer agree with this Milankovitch theory. Same thing happens to the patch results. Now, those two they're too high. Okay, so it messes up the results. And this paper, by their own reckoning, not by my reckoning as a creationist, by their reckoning, this paper has been invalid for 25 years. But hardly anybody knows about it. And here's where the reinforcement syndrome comes in. Even though that's the case, uniformitarian scientists still assume this paper's correct, as well as the particular version of this Milankovitch theory that it supposedly. You will see papers where other scientists will confirm these results, that even though the results are invalid by their own reckoning. That's the reinforcement syndrome, okay? And this shows up. So we've already seen a little bit of example here where this astronomical theory is making a contribution to climate change alarmism. That's why we're talking about this. And as we're going to see, there are two other ways that this Milankovitch theory contributes to climate change alarmism. That's why this reinforcement syndrome is a big deal. Now, if you'd like to learn more about this, we've got 3 articles in our Acts and Facts magazine explaining this research that I did. It also gives you the references for the technical papers if you want to read that. And there's one thing I'm really excited about. I have published let me put it this way. I have 2 other papers that are in press that are supposed to be published by one of our sister ministries in what we call the Journal of Creation. And I found out there's a shortcut method where you can verify my results even without having to do a lot of complicated math, which I think is so cool. That means you high school kids can do this, okay? The hardest math is to find the equation of a straight line through 2 points, and I actually do that for you. But it's pretty straightforward. There's a simple conceptual argument where you can see that, you need to multiply those numbers by 1.11, 1.12, 1.13, and you can verify these results are no longer valid. And if you'd like to learn more about the Milankovitch theory and why it's wrong with some of the problems with it, as well as some of the other circular reasoning that scientists do, we've got a DVD on the Ice Age. And again, we have a much superior explanation for an ice age. And we've also got a book called Creation Basics and Beyond that deals with the ice age, deals with these ice cores, things like that. And I contributed to those chapters, the chapters on the ice age, the ice cores, radioisotope dating, and maybe 1 or 2 other chapters. So this astronomical theory is contributing to this climate change alarmism. So we see that, and remember, this theory is tied to evolution millions of years. So we've already seen they've concluded the climate is unstable. They're also concluding that you can have catastrophic rise in sea level. Now, how many of you have heard that? How many of you have heard that global warming is going to cause catastrophic rise in sea level? A lot of you. Well, I'm going to tell you why that is here in a second. Okay, so here is a respected evolutionist, and he's talking about rising sea level. And he says this, when can we expect to see a rapid rise of sea level 10 times higher than the present values of a few millimeters per year? We do not know. All we can say from experience with the many millennia of the ice age records in the deep sea, that is those seafloor sediment cores that they're getting from the ocean floor, is that once melting starts, it stimulates further melting for centuries. Deglaciation, or melting of the ice, keeps going once begun in example of the dilemma of the sorcerer's apprentice. Now, I want you to notice here, he's drawing this conclusion from what he calls experience with many millennia of the ice age records in the deep sea. That is the seafloor sediment cores. So why would the seafloor sediment cores in this astronomical theory lead them to conclude that you can have catastrophic sea rise? Well, here's the reason. They use this astronomical theory to date ice cores and seafloor sediments. Okay, it's a technique that they call orbital tuning or wiggle matching, and it works something like this. Let's say you have a seafloor sediment core, and you've plotted the oxygen isotope wiggles in it, and let's say you have another core. It doesn't even have to be the same length, and it could be located hundreds or thousands of miles away, but you're going to have wiggles there. Any two pattern of wiggles, you're going to see features that kind of look similar, right? So you see we got a prominent peak in the first one, and you can match it to a prominent peak in the second one, right? Okay, well, we got a prominent trough down here. You can match it there. And the assumption they make is that when you have features that are similar in different cores, the working assumption is that they're the same age. Now, this is not based on any kind of radioisotope dating. They're just looking at the wiggles, and because the wiggles look alike, they say they're the same age. Okay? And so they transfer ages from one core to another, and they can even do it with the ice. Okay? They can transfer those ages to ice cores. Well, remember, where are those ages coming from? They're coming from the astronomical theory, which is coming from this paper, which, as we said earlier, is invalid. All right, so here's the bottom line. Why is this leading them to conclude that you can have catastrophic rise in sea level? Well, if you're going to calculate the rate at which the sea level is rising, you need two things, right? You need the change in sea level, how much it goes up or down, but you also need the time it takes for that change to occur. So if you're going to calculate a rate change for the sea level, that's what you need. All right, so let's think about this for a second. Where do you get the change in sea level? Remember how we said that if you knew the global ice volume, that would tell you the sea level? They're getting the change in sea level from the global ice volume. Where are they getting the global ice volume? That's coming from these oxygen isotope values, which is coming from the seafloor sediments. Now, what about the time? Where's the time coming from? It's coming from the astronomical theory, because remember, they use the astronomical theory to assign ages to the wiggles. So that's where they're getting these rates from, and it's coming from this theory that by their own reckoning, the original argument is no longer valid. So this concern over rising sea levels is being fueled, at least in part, by the astronomical theory. Did I mention this paper's been invalid for 25 years? Just want to make sure you realize that, okay? And not only that, they're worried about extremely rapid climate change. Here's another climate scientist who said that climate in Greenland during the last interglacial period, that's one of the warm periods, was characterized by a series of severe cold periods which began extremely rapidly and lasted from decades to centuries. As the last interglacial seems to have been slightly warmer than the present one, its unstable climate raises questions about the effects of future global warming. Okay, so here's the reasoning. They assume, remember, they believe there were many ice ages. They think we're in just the latest, most recent warm period, and they believe the present is the key to the past and vice versa. And so since the previous warm period was unstable, maybe this one is too. And that's why we need drastic action to fight global warming. But in reality, the ice age was caused by the flood, which is a never-to-be-repeated event because God promised it would never happen again. And you may very well have had rapid climate changes during the ice age after the flood, but because it's a never to be repeated event. It's invalid for them to look at the data and to try to use that to predict future trends. So their denial of biblical history is leading them to conclude that our climate is unstable and you can have rapid catastrophic change. And again, this is all based on an argument that by their own reckoning is no longer valid. So you got the evolutionary connection, you have a reinforcement syndrome, and we also have an incomplete understanding of climate. This is another reason that we ought to just not panic on this issue. The climate models tend to overpredict the amount of warming, and there's a good chance they're not, well, there's no doubt they're not including all the relevant physics. And even the people who are alarmists on this issue will tell you that one of the big sources of uncertainty are the clouds, because the clouds are sort of a wild card. Clouds can reflect solar radiation, which tends to give you a cooling effect, but they can also absorb infrared radiation from the ground. They can radiate it, and that could give you a warming effect. So here's the question. Do clouds give you net heating or cooling? Well, that depends on which effect is larger. And that, in turn, depends on things like latitude, altitude of the cloud, as well as droplet sizes. And clouds that have smaller average droplet sizes tend to reflect more sunlight. So here's the question. Are there factors affecting droplet sizes that the climate models are not taking into account? Well, I think so. And my PhD research touched on this. We don't have time to get into this right here, but I am convinced by the Lord's grace, He had me work with someone who has really figured out a key to understanding how the clouds are going to have an effect. And this is something people have wondered about for a long time. If you'd like to learn more about this, I have 4 technical papers in the Journal of Creation. You can, if you go on the web and go to creation.com, those articles are archived there and you can read them, but they are technical. I have to warn you, they are technical. And it explains what's going on here. And it involves the sun. The sun is having a role here. And people for many years have thought maybe the sun could be affecting weather and climate, and this may be the mechanism by which that's happening. Okay, so we have also an incomplete climate understanding, and we've got some fishy science that has been used to push this idea of global warming. Now, this is Michael Mann. He is a climatologist at Penn State University, and he became somewhat famous back in the late 1990s because of 2 papers that he published, which seemed to show that there was this dramatic rise in temperatures at the end of the 20th century, particularly in the northern hemisphere. And you see this trend here. Notice that it kind of looks, you see the green there? Kind of looks like a hockey stick turned on its side. For that reason, people call this the hockey stick graph. And this was used to push this idea that we have runaway warming, that we're headed for a catastrophe, and that we've got to do something quick here. And there were 2 big conclusions from this paper. The first was that the 1990s were the warmest decade, not of the last century, but of the last 1,000 years. And that 1998 was the warmest year of the last 1,000 years. Well, that's weird because people have known for a long time there was something called the medieval warm period around 1100 to 1400 AD. But Michael Mann's graph made that medieval warm period disappear. Okay, his graph did 2 things. It made the medieval warm period disappear, and it seemed to show these dramatic rise in temperatures at the end of the 20th century. Well, there were some Canadian researchers who took a hard look at Michael Mann's research, and they concluded it was very seriously flawed. And of course, these guys are Canadians. They know their hockey sticks, right? Okay, so they basically broke his hockey stick in half, and basically, Mann was kind of cheating. He had this algorithm that he was using, and it deliberately gave much greater weight to data sets that were showing a temperature rise. And it emphasized those data sets and downplayed the others, and it made it look like this warming was there. So this is, if you run the data the way Michael Mann did, you get something that looks like that. But if you do it the right way, you get that. Okay, and there's no obvious warming trend, or certainly not a dramatic warming trend at the end of the 20th century. And a lot of people have since been very critical of this. There's a very respected physicist at Berkeley who said this. He said, that discovery that man had used an improper method hit me like a bombshell, and I suspect it's having the same effect on many others. Suddenly, the hockey stick, the poster child of the global warming community, turns out to be an artifact of poor mathematics. And there are a lot of other researchers out there who have been much, much harsher in their criticism of Michael Mann. They said he's guilty of outright fraud. Okay? But that was used to push this idea of global warming. Now, I don't know how much you all are keeping up with this, but just the other day, there was another climate scandal where a former worker, researcher at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, claimed that they were manipulating the data to make it look like this warming trend had actually gone through the pause. Remember we said how there's apparently been no warming for the last 18 or 19 years? Well, apparently there was something called the Pause Buster paper that supposedly showed, oh, that's not right. We really did still have warming, and it was even faster than we thought it was. Well, it turns out it looks like they were fudging the data to get that number. So we got some fishy science that is being used to push this idea of catastrophic global warming. And I want to give you one more reason that Christians ought to keep cool on this, and it's spelled out by the first letter of each of those reasons. That's fire. The Bible says a lot about fire, okay, coming fire, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Folks, we can't save the planet, okay? We can't. And I'm not saying we should not be good stewards of what God has given us, but the Bible makes it clear this world in its present form is temporary. And a lot of Christians are kind of jumping on this bandwagon. And I think we need to keep things in perspective. And I want to read another passage of Scripture, one that is extremely sobering and ought to give us perspective on this issue. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Now, there are a lot of Christians who are jumping on this global warming bandwagon, saying that this needs to be a priority for the church. And my question is that a diversion or a distraction from a much more urgent issue? The last time I checked, the Lord did not commission us to save the planet, but to proclaim the gospel to every creature and to make disciples of all nations. Okay, so we just need to keep cool on this issue. We need to keep this in perspective. If you'd like to learn more about this, ICR does not do a whole lot with global warming. That's not really our emphasis, but we do talk about it a little bit. And we've got some articles dealing with this if you'd like to learn more. We also have a free booklet on the Ice Age. We're giving those away. Please help yourselves. It's one that I wrote. It talks more about the Ice Age and how the Bible explains it. And we've got a free magazine called Acts and Facts. If you haven't signed up for it, please do so. It comes free to your house every month, and it's got great articles that answers your questions. Okay, yes. Yeah, you can sign up for it online. That's true, yes. Yeah. You can do it here or you can sign up online, yes. Uh-huh. Right. Right. I don't think we have. Now, they claim there's an island somewhere that's they're claiming it's going to be covered by the ocean. But, I don't think there's been any significant change, really. And I think the real alarmism is coming from the way they're interpreting that seafloor sediment data, which is flawed. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's the one, yeah, I was thinking of you. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, that's one isolated example. And I mean, is it sinking? Is it? I don't know. I mean, it seems to me, Lo, that if it was really something to worry about, you would see it everywhere. It would be something very obvious, very dramatic. And there are even secular scientists. My advisor, my PhD advisor at the University of Texas at Dallas, he's a secularist. He believes in man-made global warming, but he says, why on earth would you worry about changing sea levels? Because even if they do change, it's so slow, contrary to what he says. Of course, maybe my advisor was ill-informed on this. I think you have contradictory perspectives in the secular community. Okay, this Wolfgang Berger guy says, based on his interpretation of the seafloor sediment data, you're going to have a catastrophic rise. Others are saying, no, the change is going to be so slow and small, why would we worry about it? So, I don't think there's any good reason for us to be getting worked up on this. Now, I don't want to, we're already a little bit over, I think. It's a little after 10. No? We got time? Okay. All right, okay, more questions. Uh-huh. Okay, that's a good question. Now, in the Antarctic, the ice is increasing. Now, the Arctic, supposedly it's decreasing. And to be honest, I don't really keep up with that a whole lot. But I talked to a guy who, yesterday, who's a meteorologist, and I was asking him about this because he said it's not true that there's been this catastrophic decrease in Arctic sea ice. He said there was one example where they claimed that there was now an ice-free corridor in the Arctic, but what they didn't tell everybody was that an icebreaker had gone through there and done that. It sounds to me, I don't worry about it. In fact, I'll tell you, before the flood, we don't think there was any Arctic sea ice or in Antarctica, So I'm not sure, in fact, if all the Arctic sea ice did melt, that would not contribute at all to a rise in sea level. It's only if the ice on land melts, because it's like an ice cube. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but if you have an ice cube in your glass of tea, when the ice cube melts, the level doesn't rise. Because ice expands when it freezes, and when it melts, it contracts by exactly the same amount of volume that was above the level. I know. Uh-huh. Yeah. I think there's again, that's not something I keep up with a lot. But I frankly don't trust these people. I really don't. And I don't think you should either. I think you have to take anything they say with a grain of salt. And I've tried to keep an open mind on this. I want to be like Larry Vardaman, okay? If there's objective data indicating that there's warming going on, I don't want to deny that, okay? But when you have all these scandals, like just last week, when it looks like they're fudging numbers, it's like it's not just that we don't have a reason to believe them. We now have a positive reason not to believe them. They're giving us reasons to not trust them. And so I take anything they say with a grain of salt. Yes. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, it's not so much when they say they're uniformitarians, it's not that they deny that change occurs. It's that they deny that anything out of the ordinary has happened, specifically anything out of the ordinary described in the Bible. Okay, when you boil it down to its essence, uniformitarianism, the bottom line is they deny the creation, they deny the flood. Okay, so if they have change here, they're okay with asteroids slamming into the earth and wiping out the dinosaurs. That doesn't sound very uniformitarian to me, but they're okay with that. They're okay. They're even okay with catastrophe, just as long as it's not the catastrophe described in the Bible. So, if you're looking for logical consistency from evolutionists, don't hold your breath, okay? So don't be surprised if they contradict themselves, okay? Run that by me again. Uh-huh. No, they try to be systematic about it, but they will routinely connect. Like you'll have in fact, I've got some articles online where there was a New Zealand core where they were assigning age. This is a New Zealand core from the off the coast of New Zealand, and they had that thing tied to ice cores in Greenland, a seafloor sediment core off the coast of Portugal, some off the coast of South America, an ice core in Greenland, in Antarctica. It's like an interconnected web. So they will connect cores that are separated by thousands of miles. Oh, well, now when you're talking about the ice, there's no column there, okay? And I don't think you don't really see a column in the seafloor sediments either. Okay, so I don't think your question is really applicable, because when you talk about the geological column, that's on land. Okay, it's not in the ice, it's not in the seafloor sediments. But they do believe those seafloor sediments are hundreds of thousands and millions of years old. Yes.
What is your explanation for the increasing CO2?
We may be doing it. We may be contributing to that. But remember the issue about this. The issue is not whether or not increasing CO2 by itself would cause an increase in temperature. It would. The question is, are there what will the feedbacks do? Okay? Will they exacerbate a warming, or will they counter it? Will they minimize it? And that's the big issue. And I tend to think the climate's not that sensitive. But I just do, for both theological reasons, primarily theological reasons, but also because let me tell you this as well. One way they estimate climate sensitivity is from paleoclimatological data, okay? Meaning an old Earth evolutionary interpretation of the data, which is wrong. So that's one thing I want to drive home. A lot of this alarmism is coming from a belief in evolution and a belief in millions of years. They're connected. There's a subtle connection there. Yes?
The fundamental thing I think that's going on here is that if we think man is responsible, then they can sound these alarms, and it's an issue of control.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's a political control issue, as opposed to saying God is in control of the world.
Right.
And what's happening to it and the cycles it goes through.
Oh, yeah. Don't get me wrong. I'm not denying that. Okay, I believe there's a lust for power out there, and they want to control how much electricity we can use, because if they can limit our energy use, it makes it easier to control us. I think that's true. I think that's coming into play. I think some of it's simple old-fashioned greed, where they've got these carbon credits, and they're making all this money. That's coming into it too. But I don't want to. But what I'm trying to point, that's something most of us already know. I'm trying to point out some stuff that I think most of us did not already know. But I don't dispute that. I think there's some old-fashioned greed and lust for power coming into play too.
This is building on what Kent was talking about.
Uh-huh.
Back in the 1980s, Christian Heritage College, I office was very
Oh, okay.
So one of the discussions that we had was about carbon dioxide and global warming.
Right.
One of the points that we were talking about was carbon dioxide is likely to cause more evaporation of water.
Right.
It comes back to your clouds.
Right.
Water is composed of global warming gas.
Yeah. Well, not really. But everything you've said is true. And let me make it clear, I'm not a climatologist, okay? I'm a physicist, but I've done some work dealing with climatology, okay? So I don't want to make it sound like I know more than I really do, okay? But it's interesting, though. Both areas of research that I've worked on recently for my PhD and this Milankovitch theory, they are very relevant to this climate change issue, okay? But I don't want to make it, I don't want to make it sound like I have a climatological background. Okay, my PhD is not in climatology, so I don't really look at all the ins and outs of that a whole lot. But I'm more interested in what is the evolutionary connection to the alarmism. Yes. Right. Right. Yes, It did. There's no doubt it did. And, I don't know if you all know who Judith Curry is. She's a respected climatologist who was at the Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech. She recently retired because she said she couldn't handle the craziness anymore of climate, the craziness of the climate field anymore. But what was interesting, around that time, she wrote in a Wall Street Journal editorial where she publicly, and this is amazing that she would do this, publicly broached the idea that maybe these government agencies were collaborating with the White House to try to sell, she apparently was very suspicious of the timing of the paper as well. And for her to do that on, a Wall Street Journal article, that's amazing. Because she's basically suggesting there's something underhanded going on, and she's doing it in a public forum for the whole world to see. So she was very suspicious, I think, even at the time, and it looks now like those suspicions were justified. Yeah. Yes.
One point I would like to make to you.
Okay.
One of the leading climate scientists here at Texas Tech University, a lady,
Okay.
and I don't know her name. I know her husband is Dr. Andrew Spurlin.
Okay.
Without religion.
Okay.
So, for you, I don't know what her name is.
Okay. Hey ho. Okay. I don't know if I don't think I've heard of her. Oh, wait a second. She's an evangelical Christian, right? And they've made a lot of her because she's saying we need to get working. Oh, yes. I know who you're talking about. Yeah. But yeah, I know what you're talking about. But see, again, she's accepting the evolutionary interpretation of the data. Okay. Now she says you don't have to do that. You can just go back 6,000 years, but you have to get the time scale right, and their time scales aren't right. And so, one thing I've noticed is that Christians who accept evolution and an old earth, they seem more inclined to accept the idea of catastrophic global warming. Now, of course, the converse is true as well. Those of us who don't accept evolution and an old earth, we're less likely to accept it. Now, they would say that's because we're not open-minded and we're not looking at the evidence. I do think there is a spiritual component to this, but I'm not sure. It's not always obvious what it is, because you could be a 100% Orthodox Christian and believe in catastrophic global warming. You could. I think you're being misled if that's the case. But I think there's definitely a spiritual component. It's sometimes a little hard to see what it is, but for instance, the National Center for Science Education, which is an anti-creation outfit, they have now made defending climate change one of their big issues. So there's obviously some kind of connection there. I've talked with some of my coworkers about what the connection is, and we've got a few ideas, but there does seem to be a connection. Of course, there's a subtle evolutionary connection there as well. Okay? Yes? No, that's okay.
The man-made global warming.
Right.
Is it man-made because there's too many humans breathing carbon dioxide, or is it man-made because we've got engines?
Mainly the engines, although I wouldn't put it past them to say that we need to stop breathing too. Some of them have said stuff like that. In fact, let me tell you. Oh, how are we on time? We need to go. Okay. Okay. Last question. Okay. One more. Oh, that was the last question. Okay. When I was teaching at Lamar University in Beaumont, my alma mater, in 2006, we sort of hosted this science symposium for teachers, and there was a guy there, a biology professor named Eric Pianka, from the University of Texas at Austin, who was a biologist, and he gave a talk where he suggested that 90% of us need to die in order to save the planet. And it was all over the place. It was on talk radio. It was in the internet. I wasn't there for that talk. I was sick that day, so I didn't actually hear it. But I distinctly remember when we hosted that conference. So when I say some of these guys say we ought to stop breathing, I'm not being necessarily facetious. Yeah. Oops. All right, you're welcome. Yeah. Okay.